Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin, and welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Many have found themselves appalled in recent months by events at some of our leading campuses seeking to shut down what appears to be the perfectly reasonable exercise of academic freedom, whether it is university-issued placemats in the Harvard dining halls seeking to give students politically correct talking points as to how to speak to their families about controversial issues, or uncivil student attacks on faculty members at Yale who had expressed opposition to administration edicts on appropriate Halloween costumes, or students taking over the president's office at Princeton to demand that the name of Woodrow Wilson be removed from venerable university institutions because, in their view, our 28th president was a racist. Here to help us understand what is going on is Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie Slaughter is president and CEO of New America, a Washington think tank. She was the first woman to hold the post of Director of Policy Planning in the U.S. State Department. She was formerly the dean of Princeton's prestigious Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and she is the author of the best-selling and widely discussed book, Unfinished Business: Women, Men, Work, Family, about women's and men's wrenching conflicts as they make difficult work-life choices. Anne-Marie Slaughter, we are delighted to have you back on the program.
I'm delighted to be here.
Now, what is going on at our universities? I mean, when I went to college, as did you, I thought students were there to learn and teachers were there to teach.
Well, so I think a lot of different things are going on. And I have to say, when I was there, we demonstrated against Princeton's investing in South Africa. So I did my time marching around in front of Nassau Hall holding a placard telling the university to divest. And of course, 10 years before I was there, or maybe closer to when you were there were all the protests about the Vietnam War. So the protest on campus is not new. I think part of what's happening here is a sense on the part of minority students in what are venerable, old, white, largely male, traditionally institutions, that they're not being heard, that there are things in the way the university is named or is conducting its business that are offensive and that are and their voices are not being heard. And I'm all for their voices being heard. I guess the question is then what follows from that?
So the way to be heard is to take over the president's office for a couple of days.
Well,
I want to get his attention.
He did get his attention.
Comes to work and he sees them.
That's true. But although, to be fair, having been dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, there had been complaints for many years on the part of minority students that Woodrow Wilson was a racist, and he was. I mean, part of this debate has reminded people that he resegregated the federal government. He wasn't just a passive racist. He actually acted on his views. And that, yes, for a minority student to be in a school named for somebody who thought you were inferior to whites is a tension. I would say, as a woman, there are plenty of people whom Princeton buildings are named for who did not ever think women should be at Princeton. So I'm sympathetic to the need to be heard, and I understand the sort of need to really make a statement. I think the question is, how then do you respond?
Well, let's talk about Wilson for a minute. I mean, Wilson had a special relationship to Princeton. I mean, they didn't name the Woodrow Wilson School after Wilson simply because he was someone who held political power.
Yes.
They named it after Wilson because he was, first place, a graduate of Princeton. He was the president of Princeton. He started the preceptorial system. He coined the term, which is the watchword of Princeton's faith, Princeton in the nation's service. Really, it was someone who merited recognition.
I agree with you. I agree on all those points. Indeed, without Woodrow Wilson, Princeton could still be a gentleman's country club. I mean, he has a particular role at Princeton, and yes, Princeton in the nation's service is what many of us who went to Princeton are proudest of. He also conceived of the Woodrow Wilson School. He had a vision in around 1900 of a school of law and government that would be for undergraduates. So it isn't just being named for a president. That said, I would not change the name of the school. I do think that we could present a much more nuanced version of who Woodrow Wilson was. And I would use the example of Thomas Jefferson, because I grew up in Charlottesville. And when I used to go to Monticello, it was all about the great Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence and founded the University of Virginia and just all the wonderful things. No one ever mentioned that he had slaves. No one ever mentioned that he fathered children with one of those slaves, nor that he did not free his slaves when he died, the man who wrote All Men Are Created Equal. But now when you go to Monticello, those stories are told, right? So you see the whole man, and you see a man who was a great man, but also a flawed man. And I think we could do much more of that at Princeton.
So would you take down the mural of Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson Hall? It's a beautiful mural. It's where people dine, the way they took down the statue of Lenin in Moscow?
No, I mean, so, you know, I think there really is a question about how do you do this? You could imagine having a permanent exhibit in the atrium when you walk in about Woodrow Wilson as president or Woodrow Wilson and race, something that said very prominently, this man whose name graces this school, this is another part of his legacy. Now, you know, we have come way beyond that, so that today we can debate it, so we can criticize it, we can condemn it, we can understand that, yes, he was a man of his times, but there were men of his times who were not as racist as he was, but something that makes clear that the university understands that and respects the feelings of those who he thought were inferior. Although I have to say, he also thought women were inferior. He finally did support the 19th Amendment, but under duress.
It's hard really to imagine Wilson as a racist, although our attitudes toward race in this country have evolved over time. I mean, we had another Princeton graduate, James Madison, after whom a building is named at Princeton, who went to Princeton and had a distinguished career, who was one of the founding fathers and wrote the Constitution. Along with Hamilton and John Jay. And these founding fathers, many of them were slaveholders. Washington freed his slaves, but the others did not. And are we to take their names off all buildings at the institution, despite the fact that they really bring honor and luster to the institution because they were the founding fathers of our country?
Yes, they were. And I would argue that the words they wrote have been the words that successive generations of citizens have been able to hold our government and our society to, so that all men are created equal really meant all white men of property. You know, that's really the men that the founding fathers thought about. But over time, you know, first men who didn't have property, then African American men, then women, then different classes, all citizens have been able to do that. I would not support taking the name off. I mean, there's some cases in which I would. I remember in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when my son was going to a local elementary school, it was named for Louis Agassiz, who was a pretty vicious racist, and that was renamed the Baldwin School, and that was fine because it was a school that belonged to the people now. Great institutions like our great universities, I think instead of taking away, we should add. It should be more. It should foster debate about how somebody could be very good in some ways and bad in others. That's also part of a liberal arts education, right? It's to teach people to take the simple and make it complex, right? To question, to challenge. And in that sense, I would say that I think a lot of these African American students have complicated what is sometimes too easy a picture.
So if you were to rename the Woodrow Wilson School the Martin Luther King School of Public and International Affairs, I mean, that would be problematic too for many. First place, he didn't have that much to do with international affairs. And secondly, he had a complicated personal life. I mean, and would we be honoring his sins as well as his virtues?
Well, I mean, again, we have holidays. I mean, there is no founding father that I can think of, maybe George Washington, but I probably don't know enough about it, who does not have a complicated life in some way. And many of our great presidents, many of our great figures, absolutely. And again, that's the point, that you don't just put them in sort of two dimensions, you see them as a whole. I would not rename the Woodrow Wilson School the Martin Luther King School. I could imagine naming a lecture hall in it or some part of it for Martin Luther King, or probably better, for some Princeton graduate who had played a really progressive role on race to add to the picture. But what I think is important is I watched the videos at Yale where lots of people were appalled that this young African-American woman was screaming at the
Erica Christakis.
Right. Well, but she was actually screaming at Nick Christakis.
The
right.
husband, yeah.
The husband. And, when you looked at it, you thought, wait a minute, this, as you said, this isn't civil debate. But what I saw was a young woman who felt she really just wasn't being heard. And her scream was just the frustration of, why can't you hear me? And she was saying, and I thought with some justice, my college needs to be a place where I feel safe. It is my home. It is my dorm. And I have to feel safe here, and you're not hearing me. And I think she was right that to simply respond with the classic, well, this is a haven for free speech, was not taking account of someone's lived experience that frankly, he'd never gone through.
But don't we all feel unsafe to some degree in a free society? We read things in the paper every day. We hear things in the political campaign that are microaggressions that make us feel uneasy.
Yes.
At Harvard, students said, Harvard Law School, your alma mater, they said students shouldn't be taught the law of rape because it was disturbing and students felt unsafe. But who is going to administer the law of rape, execute the law, make the law, find nuance in the law, except lawyers? And how are they going to do it if they're not taught about the law of rape?
Okay, so we'll shift ground to my other alma mater. I have many alma maters.
All these alma maters, you can tell us what's going on.
So, with respect, I think that white men suffer many fewer microaggressions than others in the society. I would agree with you that there's some places all of us feel unsafe. But I do think the experience of an African-American woman, or a woman generally, or an African-American man, is materially different, right? And that until you have, and you can't really put yourself in their shoes. And I will just say, as a woman, I certainly have been on the other end of what I would regard as gross insensitivity when the man didn't realize he was being grossly insensitive. So I think we have to listen hard. And again, my response would be, yes, of course you have to teach the law of rape, but let's think really hard about how to do this, because I remember learning it, and I honestly pity the man who was teaching it. And, maybe you bring in a visiting professor at that point. Maybe maybe you really think this is something a woman's going to handle better. And because men can be raped too, but in general, we're thinking more about women. So I don't think the answer ever, or almost never, is to erase, to silence, to whitewash. I think this is a particular choice of words. But I do think we need to hear and think hard about being as inclusive as possible. And a university is also a community, right? The university does not abide by the First Amendment. Certainly Princeton doesn't. There is a norm of civility, and universities have speech codes where there are things you can say that you would be perfectly legal that are deemed really beyond the pale. So I think you want to foster free speech, but you want to foster respect and civility. That still means you ought to be able to say tough things, but you ought to understand the context in which they'll be received.
Well, even the study of the evolution of those contexts, of those concepts, because certainly you were at Princeton. Professors were able to refer to homosexuals in the 1960s in ways that far different from what would be acceptable now.
Yes.
So the ideas evolve themselves
Right.
as to what you can say and what's decent to say.
Right.
But at the same time, intellectually, you have to be able to understand the evolution. That's an academic pursuit in and of itself.
Absolutely. Well, and think about, reading Huckleberry Finn.
Yes.
Right? One of the great works of American literature, but by today's standard. I mean, the N-word is all over the place. I mean, all sorts of things are there. You would never want to stop reading Huckleberry Finn, but our understanding of Huckleberry Finn has evolved over the centuries.
So then, if you can read Huckleberry Finn for fun, why can't you on Halloween at Yale wear an Indian headdress? And why should the university be suggesting to students how they should appear on Halloween? I mean, can you dress as Snow White or as one of the seven dwarves? I mean, is that
Right.
a diminishing?
Right. I mean,
short people. I mean, where is this going to end?
I do think there. So here, I think it's perfectly legitimate when you're in a university to sensitize students to how other people will perceive them. So, I mean, I remember freshman, when I was a senior, I was a residential advisor. And I had a class of freshmen, and they showed up, and a young man from South Carolina immediately put a Confederate flag up over his bed, and one of his roommates was an African American from Richmond. And my first job was to say to this young man, you are not in South Carolina anymore. You are in a wider world. And in that wider world, what you just did will cause great pain to somebody else. Now, you can still choose to do that. But it's not that great a cost to you to take it down, and it's an enormous benefit to him to not have to look at a symbol of slavery every day in his own room. So the way I would have handled the Halloween I think it's perfectly fine to say, be aware that this really can cause real offense to others. If you choose to do it knowing that, that's your choice. We're not going to tell you you can't. But honestly, there are a million costumes you can choose, and most of us would not knowingly give offense to others if we could avoid it, unless something bigger, some higher principle were at stake.
But on the university campus, given that you don't have unfettered free speech, you don't even have unfettered free speech under the First Amendment.
Well, no, but we go pretty far.
We go pretty far.
States.
And so we have no laws against hate speech, for example.
Right, exactly.
But isn't it our national commitment that the answer to bad speech is better speech or different speech?
Yes.
And not to suppress it. So at Yale, they were seeking to suppress a form of speech. And what was the speech? Wearing an Indian headdress is funny on Halloween.
Well, so I mean, I don't recall exactly, but I didn't think they were banning those headdresses. I thought they were issuing guidelines.
Well, the guidelines were that you should think long and hard, as you put it, before when you wear costumes at Halloween, either turbans or feathers or blackface, redface, and any costume that might
that is
give
offensive.
offense to other people.
Well, so what I would say is, and it depends a lot. I mean, there's a big difference. We often say it's political correctness. Another way to talk about it is civility and respect. But I would say it is perfectly fine to have a conversation about how other people understand it. Actually, it's a great way of raising these issues and having people talk about it. And not all women, not all minorities take things the same way, right? There are plenty of people who are fine, you take it that way, but there are others who are not, and then talk about what the norms of civility and respect are, and then let people choose what they want. I mean, because again, you can choose to give offense, that's fine. You can choose it, but then you should know what you're doing. You shouldn't do it unintentionally.
Well, at Harvard, they took a different tack. And the administration issued placemats in the freshman dining halls that had various topics, and they were kind of talking points for students to talk to their parents when they went home on vacation. So, you were a student, your father was a lawyer, you went home. Did you need coaching from the administration as to how you should talk to your father about issues like what's going on at Yale? Should we be admitting Syrian refugees?
Right.
All the other contemporary issues. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think many students sort of enjoy the vigorous debate over the dinner table at home.
I remember very clearly saying to my father that it was a good thing that I was starting where I was, because if I started where he was at young, I was going to end up as a reactionary. I was so mad at him, Now I'm his age then, and I certainly understand his positions. That one, I have to say, does strike me as very inconsistent with the mission of a great university. I mean, the point is to teach students to debate and to think critically and to think independently and
form their own ideas.
Yes, exactly. So that surprises me. There's no code here, and I do think, as I said before, I think part of the point is to take something that seems simple and look at it from different angles and understand it isn't so simple, but I would have left students to their own devices when they went home.
Well, and it's illustrated by what actually happened at Harvard, because the Student Republican Club published a placemat with different talking points and different answers, and they sought to distribute those, and then the university said, well, they were going to withdraw all placemats. Right. They apologized to everyone, and they said the whole idea was ridiculous.
But, I will say something else. We talked about the Vietnam War, and, lots of students occupied the administration buildings. That was never going to stop the Vietnam War, but that's what they were really frustrated about. I think many African-American students, what they're really frustrated about is that they are living in a country where they're seeing videos of African-American men being gunned down by police officers, and they feel, how can this be? How can it be 2016? And you can still see someone who's unarmed being shot in the back. And that, it happens to whites, but far, far, far less often. So I think part of this, what's going on here is kind of displaced anger. And it's coming out on the things they can affect, like the naming of a building or a protest, where what we should really be doing is channeling that anger into productive protests on the real issues of the day, which are very important issues.
Well, and have the students who want to rename at Princeton delete the name Woodrow Wilson School. Have they really considered the many distinguished black graduates of the Woodrow Wilson School who are using that cachet to advance their professional careers? So we're going to change the name. So you say, well, I was formerly a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School. Now I'm a graduate of who knows what.
Well, I don't know. There are places that have changed their name, so I don't know what they actually do about that. But this is also youth versus age. I think if you take a poll of the graduates, there is very little support for changing the name among African Americans or anybody else. The students often feel differently, and I think the undergraduates feel differently than the graduate students. After all, the graduate students chose to come to the Woodrow Wilson School knowing that's what it was named. The undergraduates choose to come to Princeton, and they don't have the same attachment. These aren't necessarily Woodrow Wilson School majors who were making this argument.
So was President Eisgruber wrong, in your view, to say he was going to consider the point and refer it to a commission of educators and trustees and academics?
You know, initially I was very surprised, but on reflection, I think he was right. I think what he was doing, and of course, you know, President Eisgruber is a constitutional law scholar. He's written on the First Amendment. And I think what he was saying is, I hear you. I hear you, and I am not going to dismiss you out of hand. I'm not going to say, oh, you're young, or oh, you don't understand. I hear that this is important to you, and I'm going to take it seriously. And so we're going to deliberate, which is, again, that's part of what we teach people to do. We're going to deliberate, we're going to have multiple perspectives, and we will make a considered decision. I think that was the right choice.
So we're going to deliberate, and we've run out of time. And Anne-Marie Slaughter, I have a question for you.
What's that?
You've been marvelous, and the question is, has political correctness run riot at our universities?
And I would say no.
You'd say no.
I'd say no.
Thank you so much for coming by. The lady said no. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more Conversations in the Digital Age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.